What we're going to do today is a rather unusual session. I've never done one on this subject before in our network. That a common problem for a church needing revitalization is that it has lost contact with its environment. It's out of touch with the culture of our times. So how do we engage with our neighbors, communicate in a way in which they will understand? One thing I'd like to suggest and talk about in this session is that the use of the arts can be helpful in this. In Europe, I think that we are very much concerned with this. We like going to see things from the past. Someone said yesterday they lived near Dracula's castle. So you can go and see Dracula's castle, or if you come to France, there are so many castles, so many art galleries and so on. And people flock to such places. They go to concerts, they do. Art is very much part of our culture. So can we use the arts to encourage our Christians towards revitalization and in evangelism? That's what I'd like to look at today. For just a few words about my background. I didn't originally train to be a pastor. I studied French literature and philosophy at university. So I'm very much into a literary approach to life. If I want to understand people, I don't read psychology, although I'm sure that psychology has a lot of good things to say. I prefer to read a good book and see how people interact, or see a film, or go to the theater or something. That's how I learn how people react to each other, with the literary approach more than the psychological approach. So all my training has been in that direction. I live in Paris. I have a card that enables me to go to the Louvre every time I want, which is great. I don't have to queue to go in. And when I go in, I go for half an hour. And unlike all the tourists who rush through and see everything, I just choose 2 pictures to look at in the space of half an hour. And I spend time in front of them and let these pictures speak to me. In fact, before I launched the Church Revitalization Network, I was in the Arts Network of ELF for at least 1 year. Before that, I was in evangelism. So I think that the arts are God-given from the very beginning. If you look in Genesis chapter 4, I think the first 4 chapters of Genesis are absolutely vital to understand our world. Creation, the fall, and in chapter 4, the beginning of civilization and how people started to live together and create culture in the wider sense. And in chapter 4, we see how they discover different things. They discover tools and even arms, weapons made of bronze and iron. But in chapter 4, verse 21, we read about Jubal, who is the father of all who play the harp and the flute. So music was there from the very beginning, for the 4th chapter of the Bible. And the arts are everywhere. The Psalms as literature, the tabernacle, the temple, the hymns in the New Testament, the symbolism in Revelation. So I'd like to go through some of this. Culture, sometimes people talk about culture, and culture in fact is much wider than the arts. The definition of culture, according to UNESCO, which is United Nations Educational, Social and Cultural Organization, defines it in this way. It's the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual and emotional features of any society or social group that encompasses not only art and literature, but lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. In other words, culture is everything. We are immersed in culture. We never leave our culture. We are in a culture. It affects everything we do. But since often, in most countries, they have what they call a minister of culture, which is talking about arts and literature and so on. This is a particular aspect of culture which has the ability to reflect on and help us to understand the culture that we are in. So that is the wider, though culture is wider than the arts have this role. There are lots of different forms of art: literature, novels, biography, poetry, visual art, painting, photography, sculpture, music, instrumental, voice, dance, theatre, cinema. There are so many aspects of it that, and often in churches, the only one we normally use is instrumental and voice. But there are a lot more types of art that we can use. A definition of art. This is my personal definition. I recently wrote a book in French on the arts, quite a big book, which hopefully, despite this pandemic, will be published this autumn. And I define art as a production which creates effects beyond the material things which are utilized to make it. So beyond the paint, beyond the ink on the page, beyond the sounds which are made by rubbing a bow against gut or blowing through an instrument or something. And it creates an effect beyond the material things which are made. And I'd like to give an example of why I think art is important. I don't know if you know that picture. It's called Shoes. It's by Van Gogh. What is it a picture of? It's a picture of his shoes. Okay. How do people react to that? Now, if you're a city businessman, you might think, this is the fantastic life. You're going back to your roots. This is the country. This is good. If you're a teenager living in a village, you might say, that's everything I hate. I want to go to the city and be up to date. In fact, we think that this is a picture of the boots that Van Gogh used when he was an evangelist among the miners in Belgium. But the whole point is that it opens up vast opportunities of communication, because whereas very often people don't want to open up and talk about themselves, each one can talk about a picture and indirectly will talk about themselves. They will reveal something about themselves via the use of art. And this gets beyond the protective army, the armor in some way. So I want to ask the question, what is art for? What's the use of art? And there are in fact quite a lot of answers to this. One is that it helps to reveal reality. I got chosen two pictures for that. One of them is Magritte. It's a picture of a pipe, and it says in French, "This is not a pipe." Well, of course it isn't. It's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. So you have to say, okay, what does this reveal? It makes you think, oh, what is a pipe? Or a very famous other picture, it's a picture by a French artist called Marcel Duchamp. He offered this for an exhibition of independent artists in New York in 1917. It was refused, but he called it Fountain. And all it was, he went to the shop, bought a urinal, turned it on its side, signed it, and said, "This is a fountain." Is this art or isn't it art? But if it makes you think of objects around you, then why not? And there was an exhibition of modern art like that in an art gallery in Paris. And one person went round and put little things on even the electric switches saying, "This isn't an electric switch." Of course. Or "This is an electric switch," or "Created in 1996 or something. So it makes us think, what is reality? It reveals reality. It makes us see things we wouldn't have seen otherwise. Another part of art is just to give pleasure. I mean, that's an impressionist painting by Monet called The Poppies. And I think most people looking at that, it makes their heart leap. It's great. It's nice. It makes you see things. Maybe you haven't seen them in quite the same way, but it's enjoyable to look at it. It gives us pleasure. Like you can go to a concert of music, just give you pleasure. That's what it's there for. God gives us that. Another thing that art is for is to tell stories. There have always been stories. A big percentage of the Bible is stories. And in some oral cultures, they have people who have great ability to tell stories that last a long time. Greek mythology is stories, the Viking sagas, novels, Netflix, series. It's all stories. Well, C.S. Lewis, Narnia, that's a story. And stories are important because it helps us to see life. It helps us see the relationships between people, the good side, the ugly side, rebellion against God, but also very often in a story, we identify with someone, often the hero, and it helps us to see what our motives are. And very often in a story, the hero has a problem to solve, but the first problem, he realizes, the problem is in himself. And when he solved the problem in himself, his fears or his worries, then he can go out and solve the problem outside of himself. That's very, very typical of stories. Another very important part of art is to make people aware of the passage of time. This is a painting by Hans Memling in 1485, a triptych for a church or personal devotion, in which you see the woman looking herself in a mirror. The title of the painting is Terrestrial Vanity and Divine Salvation. And so you see that on the left, what our bodies will become, and on the right, you can't see all the details of it, but you're escaping the fires of hell. And a lot of paintings all the way through history if you look in a corner, you'll find a skull, for example, to make us aware that we'll all die. A lot of stories go through a person's life. And so it raises our awareness of the passage of time. And what do we do with this? How do we live our lives better and prepare ourselves for death? Art asks questions. This is a very famous painting by a French artist called Guga, and he actually gave the title, Where Do We Come From? Who Are We? Where Are We Going? And on the right, you can see a group of young women in Polynesia. He lived in Polynesia. In the middle, who are we? You can see some women working. And on the left, some old women waiting for death. And these are the big questions. And if you ask that to someone directly, they may feel embarrassed. But if you say, let's look at this picture and let's talk about it, then sometimes you can get past this. And this can be used even as an illustration in a sermon, for example. I do this very often in my church when I'm preaching. I use pictures like this to illustrate the Bible text. So art also asks questions. It stimulates our imagination. We can imagine ourselves in another time, in another place, and we can say, how would we react? This is a soldier going off to war. And you can say, what would I think if I had to go away and not be sure that I would see my wife again? It makes you think of these questions. It stimulates our imagination so that we live more fully. And finally, I haven't got one picture for this, but it transmits a vision of the world. And as Christian artists should be trying to transmit a vision of the world. What is real? What is it, the material world, or are there other things? What is important? Is time linear or cyclical? What about humans? Who are we? Are we different from animals? Where do we come from? Is there something after death? Are some humans more important than others? Do good and evil exist? How can we find out? What values should we have to live with? Can we impose these on others? What about my conscience? What about my free will? What if the authorities oppose my free will? Lots of questions. And finally, what is the fundamental problem of humanity? What keeps us from blossoming, from being free? Are the solutions proposed by politics, philosophy, psychology, sociology? Does that correspond to what I am? What if my solution is a minority that the rest of my fellow citizens don't understand? How do I deal with this? This was the 4 paintings that were made for the Lausanne movement. They wanted to make some paintings to communicate what they stood for. You probably know the Lausanne movement that started back in the 70s and is still very alive today. They had 4 paintings, and I showed these in my church at the beginning of the year, and we preached on different things. I got, first of all, the children to say, what can you see? And then the adults, what can you see? And then I preached on it. The first is the gospel for every person. So you can see a fisherman with a net. throwing his net over the whole world. The world is sideways on, if you like. You can see Africa and Europe at the bottom, North America, South America at the top. And the cross is formed of the equator and the international dateline. So that's why the cross is at that point. And so you can see there are people of all sorts of ethnic groups and all over the world who are being fished in. So we say, we want everyone in the world to know the gospel. The second picture was an evangelical church for every people. And in this one, you see a young woman who is the bride of Christ. The bride of Christ, who is the church, several verses on that, holding the light of the gospel. And you can see in the world below, and that she represents the universal church. And in the world, you can see all sorts of other little churches, each one with their light in different countries and different parts of the world and so on. So it's not just to bring people to the Lord, but we should be together, which is very much the way that Peter Mead finished his preaching in the plenary session. John Wesley said that the religion, that the gospel is not for solitary, it's for people. So that's the second one, an evangelical church for every people. The third, each picture gets a little bit more complicated. You need Christ-like leaders for every church. In other words, shepherds. So you see the good shepherd in the middle. You can see the shepherd looking after the sheep, and then various ways of looking after the sheep. You can preach the gospel and go and get the lost. Just the top left the corner is in fact Billy Graham, because he was one of the two leaders of the Lausanne movement, and he's preaching to bring in the lost sheep. And you can see above Billy Graham a shepherd with his crook trying to get lost sheep. And then you see other people. I think top right is a baptism. On the right, you see someone praying. The bottom right, washing the feet of people, serving. Then on the bottom left, carrying the lambs. And on the left, I had to go and look on the Lausanne site to see what it was. But the woman is a military chaplain in the Philippines. I might not have guessed that otherwise. The one on the middle left of the picture. So we're also praying for Christ-like leaders for every church. We're saying well, that's what we want to be. That's what we want our churches to be: preaching the gospel, baptizing, praying, serving, looking after the lambs, and so on. And then the final picture is the impact of the gospel in every sphere of society. It's a very complex one. We took a long time looking at it, but you can see there that now in the very center of the picture is a throne. The throne where Christ is enthroned, although he's actually at the moment kneeling and serving the church. You can see he's got a crown on his head, but at the same time he's washing the feet of the church. The same picture we saw for the bride in picture 2. And then all around the picture you can see things which represent different parts of society. You can see at the top left, apparently it's the skyline of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, representing business. And then in the middle at the top, you've got the China's Forbidden City, representing government. The top right, you've got Cambridge University, trying to impact the universities. And just below, you've got someone who went to Cambridge University, John Stott. And John Stott and Billy Graham were the two sort of leaders of the Lausanne movement. And then at the bottom right, most people recognize the Sydney Opera House, representing the arts. And then in the middle on the left, Hollywood, representing the media. So this is the impact of the gospel in every sphere of society. But you also have another movement, which is a very interesting one. Bottom left, you've got the creation of man. I mean, this is obviously an allusion to the Sixtine Chapel in the Vatican, the creation of man, which goes through Jesus to the bride of Christ, which is the new humanity. So the new humanity is there to bring the gospel into every sphere of society. And I went through these 4 pictures, one every Sunday, all the way through January. And this was to help people to understand this is what we're trying to do. And I think people remember those pictures. And I was very pleased that Lausanne got this artist whose name is Bryn Gillette to paint these 4 pictures for their movement. Since we're talking about the use of art among Christians, just a couple more things. Also, what does the inside of our churches look like? If you're a pastor in an old historic church, that in itself is a work of art. But our little church in Paris, our room didn't really look very nice. So I asked a Christian girl who's an interior designer to suggest some ways of decorating it, and she made several suggestions. And as a church, we went in for the color scheme in a certain direction and so on. And everyone who comes into our building, it may be very small, but they say, "Oh, this is nice. We feel very at home here. We feel very much at peace in this place." Important to have. In French society, the look of things is very important, probably more even important than music. The French are not great musicians, but they're great artists. Most beautiful cars in the world, but that's a personal opinion. So that's something. Another thing was that I commissioned a painting for a church which I pastored. This was a young French artist, and it shows the movement of the history of the world. On the left, you have creation, going through the tree of the knowledge of good and evil with Adam and Eve. Then you have the tables of the law. And in the very center of the picture, the cross, a very dark cross, with some red on it for the blood of Jesus. But in the red earth, to show it really is a historic event, and dawn breaking behind it. And this is the narrow path leading to salvation. The Holy Spirit transforming people to be Christians who are living in today's world, but one day, like the caterpillar becomes a butterfly wing, will be transformed to live in the New Jerusalem. And here you have the square representing the New Jerusalem in the Revelation, and all the colors of the precious stones. And you have the same at the creation at the beginning for the new creation. And I made postcards of that. I gave to anyone who came to the church. I gave it to our local member of parliament, to our mayor, to everyone, and to explain what the gospel was from that painting. And one other thing, I made a film for the National Council of Evangelicals. I was the producer. I got a filmmaker to make it, to encourage people to get involved in mission. The final part I wanted to say was how can art be used in evangelism? I'll just come back to one point that we mentioned in our little discussion group. Someone was saying that in some Orthodox countries, art can be misunderstood or not used. And I just wanted to come back to what I said at the very beginning. There's lots of other types of art. There's poetry, there's storytelling, there's different types of music and so on. It just happens to illustrate art. It's easier on a PowerPoint to show pictures, but of course there's all sorts of other types of art. Okay, so how can art be used in evangelism? I'll just give you 3 examples. This is an art exhibition which I created in France a few years ago. We took 20 pictures, very famous pictures, and these 20 pictures start with creation and go right through to Revelation. And so they're taking you through the biblical story, in postmodern terms, what people sometimes say, the postmodern meta-narrative. So they're going through this story. So we invite people to an exhibition on the Bible and art. We don't tell them necessarily that they're going to see the story unfolding. And we created this on these roll-ups so we can send them off to churches who can organize exhibitions very easily. And the whole exhibition is visited. You can see the people looking at it. There's no text, but people listen to an audio guide. They got this kind of telephone that they sort of hold up next to their ears and listen to the text. And what we then did, we created 3 different choices. So you could program into it a children's text, a teenager's text, or an adult text. So everyone in the family could come and watch the exhibition at the same time. And so this will help people understand that the Bible has a real story to it. And so this has been in use now for about 10 years. It travels around France in different places, different churches ask for it. And maybe you've got something similar in your country, or maybe you could make one. Or if you want to contact me, we could see about how we could let you have the pictures, and you can record your own text or something and create your own exhibition if you wish. Another thing, this is a painting that someone mentioned in our group. We got an art historian, a Christian art historian, to come and give a talk on this picture, the prodigal son of Rembrandt. And people came because people are interested in art. So she gave about half the time, she talked about the way that Rembrandt painted, and how there's a masculine hand, a feminine hand, and the attitude of the elder brother next to him, and so on. But she also told the story and explained that, you know, this is the Christian faith of coming back to the Father who forgives, and so on. So, and this can be used because people who often wouldn't come to another of our meetings, this was a kind of halfway point where they could come and hear the gospel. And the third thing about evangelism, I'm going to talk about this a bit tomorrow, targeted services. In our church in Paris, we realize that there's a diversity in today's society. So our Sunday evening service is very often based on the arts. So we're using it as a means of worship and outreach. And we always finish with pizzas. And I put a photo on the screen of one of my grandchildren with his t-shirt. Pizza is always the answer.